Well, all right, friends. It is the hour. We're at the bottom of the hour here in Southern California, and we've got folks already signed on from all over North America, and a couple of Australians tuning in. G'day, Jane and Jeff Broughton. I don't know if you actually have got a class with you, or whether you're just stealing the university's internet there, Jeff. But glad to have you with us. And all of you, particularly those of you who are new to us for the first time, we're really happy you are here. We run for about an hour and an hour and a half. That's different time zones for different ones of you, so particularly those of you on the U.S. East Coast, hang in there. I know it's going to get late, but we will get underway. Tonight is the first of our quarterly BCM webinars, and I want to give a frank explanation as to why. Namely, after 4 years plus of running these webinars monthly, our numbers dropped, and the pattern of numbers dropped to the point at which it just wasn't cost effective to do this every month. So we're going to try it quarterly, see if we can build back up our numbers. And so we really appreciate those of you who are on, and appreciate the word of mouth that spreads word of these programs. So help us rebuild this platform on a less frequent basis. We're going to try to do these more or less roughly the week before each equinox or solstice, to give you a sense of when we're going to be broadcasting. Our next webinar will be on Tuesday, December 13th, and I'll give a reminder of that before we close tonight. I want to again give a special shout out to Chris White next door here in our office. Chris does so much hard work getting these webinars ready and set, and getting many of you hooked up. So drop Chris a note and tell him thanks. Really appreciate his work, and of course he's a fellow Aussie. Well, let's get right onto it. I want to acknowledge that today, the 13th of September, is a day of solidarity with the Sacred Stone Spirit Camp in North Dakota. There are over 100 solidarity events in more than 35 cities that happened or are happening today to stand with the resistance camp at Standing Rock, North Dakota. This has been a powerful expression of Native resistance, coming together of over 200 tribal representatives, folks who have said they're not leaving until an oil pipeline across their land is stopped for good. As many of you know, last Friday, minutes after a federal court refused to stop construction on the Dakota Access Pipeline, the federal government announced that work would be stopped anyway. This was actually a unique press release by 3 different federal agencies, including the Army Corps of Engineers. In effect, this was a people's injunction, really won by the courage and witness of this resistance camp that's been going on for weeks. But although the Obama administration has paused construction on the pipeline, the fight isn't over. As Bill McKibben wrote yesterday, the Obama administration announced months ago that new projects would now have to pass a climate test before being approved. We need that test applied to this pipeline. And we need the government to make sure that anything in Indian country will be reviewed and not get built without full tribal consultation. McKibben goes on to say these are some of the greatest organizers on our continent. We've fought side by side with them in the Keystone Pipeline struggle and in a dozen other fights. And now we've got a chance to do something really special. After 500 years of being ignored by the federal government, Native Americans have forced something special, serious recognition of their rights. So tonight, in recognition of this nationwide day of solidarity, toward the end of the program, we're going to hear from our colleague and former BCM intern Nathan Holst about his visit last week to the Sacred Stone Spirit Camp. We look forward to that, so please stay with us to hear about that report. So we're very happy to be doing this webinar, mindful of this great witness in the prairies. Now, there's a bit of a history to tonight's topic. Our very first Bartimaeus Institute in 2007 was on the theme of Luke and Sabbath Economics. It was our coming out party, and as you may know, this year we're celebrating the 15th year of our Sabbath Economics booklet, which has been a central resource in our ongoing efforts to let Scripture help us forge a new, or rather an old, story about economics. We continue to explore how to reread the Bible economically in order to read the economy biblically. Tonight will be an expression of that. And so this is a part of a tradition and a series. More specifically, 6 years after that inaugural institute, inspired by the Occupy movement, we focused our institute on the theme of Luke and Sabbath Economics even more deeply, using Cornel West and Tavis Smiley's The Rich and the Rest of Us book. And the text of Luke 16 was a central focus for us. That was also the year, 2013, that we renamed our February gathering the Kinsler Institute in honor of our mentors and friends, Ross and Gloria Kinsler. So it is still named that today. Later, that year, we did a webinar on the first half of Luke 16, a reading which comes up each year C, in the lectionary in mid-September. This is, of course, the gospel text for this coming Sunday. It's the story of what I call the manager of injustice. I really believe this text is a key story that helps middle-class first world Christians imagine how and why we should subvert the dominant economic system. Though the story is typically domesticated in our churches. This webinar was based on a detailed chapter that I wrote for a Festschrift of one of our great mentors, Christopher Rowland in Oxford, England, the great historian of radical Christianity. So this is a piece that has been around our circles for a while. And as I mentioned, it comes up this Sunday. If you want to prepare for this Sunday's gospel, I commend that you take a look at my comments that will be posted on Thursday, day after tomorrow, on radicaldiscipleship.net. Those comments are a summary of the chapter in the Rowland book. Again, I really think this is an important text for us, which is widely misunderstood and misread in our churches. Tonight, however, 3 years almost to the day after that 2013 webinar on the first half of Luke 16, I want to complete our journey through that heartland of Lucan theology by looking at the second half of the chapter. After all, that is the gospel text a week from Sunday. In fact, it's kind of rare to get such a sustained look at Luke's narrative, and so the next 2 Sundays are a great time to immerse ourselves in Luke's story and theology. In fact, Luke 16 is a strategic sequence in the Gospel of Luke, which addresses the social crisis of wealth and poverty. Just as we would look at social issues in the wider context, so we should approach a biblical text in its literary context. And to that end, it's important to see the whole of Luke 16 structured as a chiasm. 2 stories with identical opening lines. There was a rich man who, bracket, Jesus' teaching, which concerns mammon and the love of money, as you can see in the outline here. What's important to recognize here at the outset is that neither of the 2 stories that frame this sequence are actually identified as parables, although they're often called that. Luke clearly narrates at least 12 parables throughout his gospel. and names them as such, but not here in chapter 16. It's more like these are real-world tales, object lessons, so to speak, and they're deeply connected not only with each other, but also with another sequence later in Luke's Gospel. Luke reiterates this rhetorical strategy 2 chapters down the line in another similarly structured sequence, as you can see here. Teaching and healing stories in chapter 18 and 19 are again bracketed by 2, in this case, contrasting object lessons regarding rich men and discipleship. Note the parallels between these 2 sequences. Each of these paired sequences could be titled 2 Rich Men and a Beggar, and they represent the heart of Luke's theology as it concerns economic justice. So these suggest that the problem of economic disparity was primarily an ethical and theological issue for the wealthy. This is why Luke's Gospel is so important for doing popular education in our first world context, where by global standards, all of us really are among the wealthy. The basic dilemma underlying all of these stories in Luke is articulated in what we might call the punchline to this Sunday's Gospel text in the first half of Luke 16. And that is the absolute incompatibility between God and mammon, as you see here in this famous text. Now, this contrast goes all the way back to the vision of Sabbath Economics in the Hebrew Bible, the people's first lesson in freedom after their exodus from empire that we read in Exodus 16. These, as most of you know, were articulated as instructions for the people to follow in order not to reproduce among themselves the slavery system of Egypt from which they had just been liberated. The manna represents the gift of creation that sustains human communities, and it is distributed from God with 3 instructions, with which most of you by now are very familiar, but which we cannot reiterate too often since they are so difficult to practice. And those instructions are that everyone should gather just enough bread for their needs. This was an ethos that proscribed too much and too little, unlike the story of modern capitalism. Secondly, the manna cannot and should not be stored up. This was a severe warning against the economics of surplus accumulation, again in stark contrast to our understanding of how to build wealth and security. And thirdly, the people must keep the Sabbath, which is revealed as a communal discipline that sets real limits on production and consumption. Again, something our addictive, compulsive society long ago abandoned. So this ancient story represents a kind of catechism in how to create and sustain a just economy: self-limitation, mutual aid, and community vigilance. And I've tried to outline this argument through the rest of Scripture in the little book on the biblical vision of Sabbath Economics. Suffice it to say, then, that the challenge for us disciples in Luke's time and our own, those of us who are caught and complicit in the mammon system, the challenge is for us to figure out ways to defect from that system while trying to rehabilitate traditional ways of manna sharing, both personally and politically. Or as Wendell Berry famously puts it, if we do not serve what coheres and endures, we serve what disintegrates and destroys. So that's the context to which we come to our text, but just a little bit more context. The problem with the dominant economy that is tackled by our text tonight, which is the gospel reading in church in a week and a half, was that the vast disparity between rich and poor in the ancient Roman Empire was a problem for Luke. Now, Modern historians Walter Scheidel and Stephen Friesen, in an attempt to determine the size of the Roman economy and the distribution of income within that economy, spent years poring over papyri, ledgers, previous scholarly estimates, imperial edicts, biblical passages. They were trying to get a handle on the state of the economy when the empire was at its zenith, so around 150 of the Common Era, about 100 years after, 70 years after the writing of Luke's Gospel. Scheidel and Friesen conclude that the top 1% of Roman society controlled an estimated 16% of the wealth. And in tonight's reading, obviously, we have a member of that 1%, and we also have a member of the poor, the much larger poor classes. But here's the shocker to that bit of ancient sociology. 16% of the wealth controlled by 1%. That's less than half of what America's top 1% control today. Now, in our world, dramatic economic inequality existing side by side is something we've gotten used to, and that we often associate as having to do with third world countries. Pictured here, for example, is the Venezuelan city of Caracas, and you can see this cheek by jowl contrast between rich and poor. We know that the global divide between the haves and have-nots has been growing over time. But in the US, this has been an increasingly defining feature since the beginning of the Reagan era, more than 30 years ago. I want to show you a graph which, quite astonishingly, it's a little hard to see, but this graph is on the cover of the new report from the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office of the US government. It just came out, and it has to do with income inequality over the last 3 decades in the US. Over that span of time, America's total family wealth has more than doubled to $67 trillion. But most average American families haven't seen a nickel of that gain. In fact, the typical American family, headed by someone under age 65, actually lost wealth between 1989 and 2013, the years of this study, after adjusting for inflation. Families in the upper reaches of the American economy, by contrast, have done just fine. Those families in the top 10%, the Congressional Budget Office calculates, have seen their net worths increase an average of more than 150%. But families in the top 1% have done the best of all. Their overall share of the nation's wealth, this new study finds, has jumped from 31% in 1989 to 37% in 2013. So as you can see, we find ourselves ironically in a state much worse than Luke found himself in. Now, the figures from the Congressional Budget Office may actually understate how unequal the U.S. economy has become. Other reputable statistical methodologies, the report acknowledges, put the current top 1% share of the nation's wealth as high as 42%. Remember, in Roman antiquity, it was 16%. So this is almost 3 times as much disparity as the world that Luke the evangelist faced. Point is, here, from a conservative source, the Congressional Budget Office, it's made clear that income inequality is growing and long ago outstripped the disparity that characterized the ancient Roman Empire. If, by the way, you want to follow these issues in this analysis, there are some fascinating statistics and narrative at the website inequality.org, which is run by dear friend Chuck Collins, does great work. So ironically and tragically, this disparity and all of the social ills and conflicts associated with it is the context not only for the ancient Gospel of Luke, but also for that of contemporary North American readers of this text, except more so in our case. I believe that's a really important thing to point out in our preaching over the next 2 Sundays. Now, a word about Luke's storytelling, because we see in the next 2 Sundays these amazing stories. Jesus was on a mission to get us to see the world differently, to unmask the illusions his audience had about the world and their place in it, in order to open their hearts and minds to what he proposed as an alternative, what he called the kingdom of God. We might call this today the deconstructing and reconstructing of consciousness. The genius of Jesus' storytelling, both parables and object lessons like those in Luke 16, was that they narrated recognizable scenarios in plain language that any illiterate peasant could understand. Jesus was, in other words, a popular educator and social animator, and his stories were fundamental to his pedagogy. These stories were, as we'll see, deeply subversive, drawing the listener in with their familiarity, only to throw a surprise twist in order to challenge popular assumptions about what is proprietary and what is possible. The tale of Dives and Lazarus shows us exactly this. It is a story so infamous that it is reproduced everywhere throughout the history of Christian art. It's ubiquitous. Now remember, this is not, in fact, a parable. It's a warning tale. It means to say, on the heels of the story of the defective manager in the first half of Luke 16, that if we do not proactively work to deconstruct the world of the rich man, then we are left with a world hostage to an impassable gulf between rich and poor. Now, aside from being a warning tale, I would go so far as to say that this is really, this story is something of a political cartoon. Some of you have seen me work with this cartoon before. It's from the mid-1990s, and it was a parody of, at that time, the savings and loan scandal, which was sort of a precursor of the later mortgage scandal, in which the federal government bailed out banks while people lost their homes. But I want you to just recognize in this political cartoon the genius of symbol and caricature. Here we have 2 characters who are dressed differently, so they represent different archetypes. The figure on the right is dressed in a suit, the figure on the left disheveled, meaning to exemplify the countenance of a homeless person. The homeless guy's cup is empty, the suit, his cup is full. They're sitting on the sidewalk in front of the White House. You see the alliteration in the 2 signs, starving and alone, savings and loan. One is silenced, the other is barking, what a great country this is. Now, this gives you a sense of why political cartoonists are so literate in cultural symbols and archetypes. I want to suggest that Luke's story is trying to do very much the same thing, and we should recognize in it symbols and archetypes that mean to caricature and parody reality. That is, it's not a fantasy, it's not a fiction, it's a caricature of that which is all too real. So Luke's story begins with a caricature of decadent wealth. Tradition names this man Dives, which is simply the Latin word for rich man. But in fact, Luke's story doesn't give him a name at all, which is the first hint we have that this is going to be a story about the radical reversal of power relations. This man, we're told, is dressed in purple. Later in Luke's 2nd volume, Acts, we hear of Lydia, the purveyor of purple. This was a luxury item In the Roman Empire, it's sort of the equivalent to fine imported Italian suits today. So in Luke's story world, this man has got the dress of the 1%. He's also, we're told, feasting sumptuously every day. Now, from a peasant perspective, feasting should take place only occasionally. It should always be shared. It was properly a community festival. But in this story world, this man feasts privately every single day. Now, we see Luke's opinion of this kind of thing in his earlier story, which portrays what we might call the solipsism of the rich. This was described in a parable back in Luke chapter 12, the parable about the wealthy landowner who has this singular concern with the gift of agricultural surplus and how to store and consume it privately. I remind you of the proliferation of the vocabulary of stored up wealth. Remember the warning in Exodus 16 here in this parable. Even more dramatically, note the first person singular pronoun. This is someone who's lost in his private world. And at the end of his internal dialogue, which is only about himself, we're told that his goal is to eat, drink, and enjoy himself. The last verb, ephraino, to make merry in a feast, is the same verb used here to describe the decadent Dives, who feasted every day while Lazarus starved at his gate. And indeed, Lazarus is the next character introduced. He is a contrast in the political cartoon. This man will be really the protagonist, the subject of this political cartoon, and he has a name. Ironically, his name is from the Hebrew, Eleazar, meaning God is my help. His positioning at the gate of Dives' mansion is oppositional. It's a spatial contrast as well as a social one. Lazarus obviously represents the archetype of those at the bottom of the social pyramid of Roman antiquity, and yet, interestingly, also here is a realistic portrait of the households of the rich. Remember that in antiquity there was a system of patronage, and in that system the only real welfare was the charity of the great toward the least. So the Roman writer Juvenal, for example, writes in his satires describing the following scenario: by attending the door of the rich, a poor client might get a sportula, meaning either a basket of food or some money to buy food for the day. In other words, it was not uncommon for street folk to offer to sort of be the doorman at the gates of a wealthy mansion and thereby try to earn a piece of bread. Of course, in this portrait, he's not even getting the crumbs, so he clearly isn't working for pay. He is completely invisible to the rich. So that's the scenario. It is clearly a political cartoon, not unlike the one we just looked at. The setting being established, we begin the plot. And the plot is very straightforward. We're told that both characters die. This is stated matter-of-factly, as is their respective destinations. I might add that this is another echo of the story of the rich farmer in Luke 12 who also dies and finds out that he can't take it with him. Here, Dives is dispatched to a place in which the spatial opposition is intensified cosmically. Right? So Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom with the angels, and his counterpart is in Hades, the underworld, the place of the dead. Now, I think I think there are many ways to wrestle with this portrait. I think this split screen vision is best interpreted through the lens of the apocalyptic discourse of the New Testament and intertestamental period, which was really the popular literature of resistance to the ancient empires of the Far East. The Greek word apocalypsis means unmasking or unveiling. It has to do with a kind of vision that is able to see through the dominant structures of empire, through the dominant stories and their fictions of entitlement and sovereignty and militaristic triumphalism, the seductive delusions of grandeur, the severe orthodoxies of law and order. Apocalyptic peers through all of that, like Morpheus in the film The Matrix, when he tells Neo that this is the world that has been pulled over his eyes. The propaganda of empire masks the truth, distorts what it means to be human, hijacks history. Apocalyptic, therefore, endeavors to pierce through that veil, to see reality from the standpoint of redemption. Now, it does this in two ways. It strips away the layers of denial and delusion that keep us distracted in order to expose realities of suffering and injustice, to see the world as it really is from the perspective of the poor and victims of violence, right? So the initial setting of this tale is the outrageous disparity between the feasting rich man and the suffering poor man. But once that is unmasked, then apocalyptic vision, this bifocal vision, transfuses our dulled and dumbed down imaginations with visions of a world as it really could and should be from the perspective of divine love and justice. To see the world enslaved and also to envision the world liberated. So what we have here in the story of Dives and Lazarus appears to be a role reversal, but what it really is, I suggest, is this apocalyptic double vision, which is trying to give us eyes to see, in the parlance of the World Social Forum movement, that another world really is possible. Now, after this initiation of the plot of life after death, we get the rest of the story really is about a dialogue between Dives and Abraham. Note the rich man's address. Father Abraham, he says, have mercy on me. Now, whether or not one is part of the Abrahamic family turns out to be actually a really important theme for Luke's gospel. For example, back in chapter 13, we have the very highly symbolic story of a woman literally bent over, crippled by indebtedness, disenfranchised, who Jesus sets free, releasing her from that indebtedness, from that bondage, from that slavery to an unjust system. And in defending his action of healing her on the Sabbath, of releasing her, lots of Jubilee language in this story, he argues that this woman too is a daughter of Abraham. So he's arguing to include the destitute as part of the Abrahamic family. Then, toward the end of Luke's story, in the famous tale of Zacchaeus, the repentant rich man, once Zacchaeus agrees to give away half of his wealth and restore fourfold anyone he has defrauded, a rather dramatic exercise in wealth redistribution, Jesus announces, today salvation has come to this house. He too is a son of Abraham. So Luke actually is trying to heal a fractured family. And right almost exactly halfway in between these two stories is this dialogue between an unrepentant rich man and Father Abraham. And this really is the essence of this famous story. But here's the kicker, and this is why I call Dives an unrepentant rich man. Look at his strategy. He petitions Abraham to dispatch Lazarus on a servant errand. Not once, but twice in this dialogue. This is an amazing exhibition of what we might call persistent presumption of entitlement. Dives has learned really nothing. Even in his new reality, he still assumes that if Lazarus exists at all, it is to run his errands. Now, Abraham's response is to point the consciousness of the rich man back to the world he inhabited. And notice here in this text that he is supposed to remember good and evil, here very explicitly defined in concrete material terms. Abraham goes on to suggest that the gulfs between the heaven of abundance and the hell of scarcity and suffering is structured right into the social architecture of wealth disparity, which is to say, insofar as we abide by that gulf in life, then why would we imagine that gulf would be transcended in the next life? An impassable gulf remains impassable. This is, in my view, a text of terror in which Abraham holds up a mirror to our social presumptions, to the maps of our reality, and says, is this all you can do? Because if it is, then those who live by this map will indeed perish by this map as well. However, undeterred and unrepentant, the rich man now intensifies his argument with Abraham. He now presumes that just as his wealth would have been passed on through patrilineal family inheritance, so should his brothers be warned about his predicament. Notice how Abraham responds. He points to the scriptures. Now, this is very, very key to Luke's theology. He says, they've got Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. But still, Dives argues, no, he says, correcting Abraham. This defiance of the biblical witness, I want to suggest, still exists in our churches. We don't want the testimony of our tradition. What we want is a miracle, a special circumstance, a divine intervention. Only then will we change our behavior. There's so much in this story. This is such a hard story for all of us who have managed to make our peace with radical disparity. Right to the bitter end, this rich man dares to argue with his ancestor. Indeed, argue with the scriptural tradition. Abraham, in turn, equally stubbornly stonewalls Dives and continues to rock Abraham in his bosom. Rock my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Rock my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Rock my soul in the bosom of Abraham. That story's not about us. It's about poor people. And that this is a text of terror to those of us actually who continue to exist in a world of disparity. But look at Abraham's closing argument. It's a stunner. Abraham says to Dives, no, if they don't hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Now, on this webinar is, I believe, Jeff Broughton. Jeff is a great theologian down in Australia. He's a student of Torvald Lorenzen's, who's a great theologian of the resurrection. And Jeff and I have both learned from Torvald how intrinsic and important the resurrection is to Christian faith and Christian testimony. And yet, knowing that, as himself an evangelist of the risen Christ, here Luke puts the scriptural tradition in front of the novum of resurrection. Scripture trumps resurrection. No special effects, no 11th hour rescue. Luke is writing this knowing that many of his contemporaries wished to be exonerated by resurrection, so they didn't have to change, rather than being empowered by resurrection to change themselves in the world. And how many folks in our churches are just like that, pointing to the resurrection as something beyond the horizon of history that's going to rescue me and the world. But that is not how Luke sees it. You see, this here is an allusion to how Luke will conclude his gospel. Because for Luke, Jesus' resurrection is understood through the lens of the Road to Emmaus story, in which an unrecognized risen Christ exhorts beleaguered disciples to study Moses and the prophets. Indeed, in the first Bible study in the history of the church, Jesus interprets these scriptures to them. This is what I mean by the claim in the title of this webinar that the story of Lazarus and Dives represents the hermeneutic key to Luke's gospel. That is, like the ending of Luke, here right smack in the middle, we get this challenge to reread the Bible, and then to reread our history, and to reread our own social maps until we get to the place in our consciousness and our practice that we will commit ourselves to destroying every gulf between the haves and the have-nots, to make sure that the chasm between wealth and poverty is not an impassable one. Well, the obvious question is, where are Dives and Lazarus today? In what ways do we walk by Lazarus every single day, and we don't have to be wearing a mink coat to be doing it? Now that's a question worth contemplating, and we would do well when we reflect on this story to make sure to set aside time to ask ourselves, if Luke's story is a political cartoon of a world that is like ours, indeed our world is even more intense in its disparities than was Luke's world, who are these characters today in our social landscape? That is a question worth asking. What I want to do, however, tonight, in that vein and in that spirit, but also in the spirit of today as a day of solidarity with our sisters and brothers at Standing Rock, is in the last part of our program, I want to try to relate this biblical tale to one particular contemporary set of issues, namely the welfare and sovereignty of Native people in the U.S., and Australians certainly could do the same for Aboriginal folk in Australia. What most of us are ignorant about is that, in fact, Native poverty is literally dispersed on the doorsteps of every state in the United States, and yet it is widely ignored. It is the way in which not only historically settler culture has committed genocide and stolen land and continued to marginalize Native people. But today, according to every possible social indicator, American Indian people are the poorest among us. 2 of the 5 poorest U.S. counties are located on Indian reservations, says the Census Bureau. Native Americans have the lowest employment rate of any racial or ethnic group in the U.S., says the Bureau of Labor Statistics. High school graduation rates are the lowest of any population, says the Civil Rights Project, with less than 50% of Native students graduating on average. As of 2011, there were over 120,000 tribal homes lacking access to basic water sanitation services, says the Environmental Protection Agency. It is estimated that almost 1 in 10 American Indian homes are without safe and reliable water, says the Indian Health Service. So, talk about an invisible person at the doorstep of America, not only historically, but still today. And yet, despite this, we also have to recognize that Native people are still here. They are inconveniently present, as one Thomas King, a Native writer in Canada, puts it. And things are changing, and changing dramatically, with a new generation of activism and cultural renewal. A few years ago, the Idle No More movement started up in Saskatchewan, Elaine's home province in Canada. And from that, we've seen a whole new chapter in the long story of Native resistance and renewal and resilience rising. And it's that I want to spend the rest of our webinar period talking about. Now, before we move to this, I do want to encourage you that if you have questions or comments about the biblical story we've just looked at, jot them down and chat them to me, because we will allow some time at the end of this webinar to address that. But for the moment, I want to draw your attention to a remarkable story that has been unfolding in the last months up in North Dakota. And then we're going to hear from Nathan Holst. And Nathan, if you are here and present, just let us know in the chat box. What I want to do here is switch screens for a minute and take us to this video, which is available on YouTube and is a brief testimony from the Sacred Rock Spirit Camp. And I'm trusting this will go well with your technology. So listen to this testimony.
It's so important for people to understand that that label of protester is so small in scope that it could never describe the protectors that are here. I am not a protester, I am protecting the very essence of what I am made up of, which is mostly water. I am protecting that for my future generations, all those that can't speak for themselves, not just the babies, but everything that flies in the sky, all those that swim in the waters, the four-leggeds. Somebody has to speak on their behalf because they don't have a voice. Women are the ones going and breaking down fences and running in front of bulldozers, and women are the ones locking arms with babies on their backs going in because it's that desperate. It's that urgent to protect life. Women are in my culture, are the keepers of the water. Men are the keepers of the fire. It's no coincidence that when we're pregnant, we carry our babies in water. And the understanding is that water is the first life. It's our very essence, our very being is made up of water. It flows through us, and it flows through from the rivers to the sky, back down in that circular way. And it's an understanding of the cycle and the natural order of things. It's just so much bigger, though, than just one pipeline. It's the fossil fuel industry as a whole. It's ultimately going to be something that comes back on us as humanity. It doesn't matter the color of our skin, it doesn't matter our religious background, it doesn't matter our age. When we desecrate the water, we desecrate ourselves. We're all, as women, going to keep on holding that line, pushing forward, hold the line for water and for life. Yeah.
This dramatic testimony not only is taken by one of the protectors that is currently at Standing Rock, but also alludes to the water walking movement that is all around North America, in which Native women are leading spiritual walks along waterways, trying to encourage folks to seek the healing of themselves and the waterways. If you're interested in learning more about the water walking movement, go to our archived webinars and look at a webinar we did in March earlier this year, in which we talked with Denise Nadeau, who's worked very closely with some of the water walkers. Had a great conversation about watershed discipleship and the resonance of water walking to that take. So that's our March 2016 webinar. But to make more sense of this protest in Standing Rock, North Dakota, that's been going on now, and which has achieved some dramatic victories, we have the great privilege of being joined by Nathan Holst up in Duluth, Minnesota. Nathan is a friend and colleague who was at the camp last week and has offered some pictures and slides and a testimony. I believe, are we going to get, Chris, are we going to get Nate on video? All right, so here we welcome Nathan Holst to the webinar.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. Can't see you yet.
Oh, okay, 1 second.
There we go.
Great. All right.
Welcome.
Thank you, Chad. Yeah, thanks for the invitation here. And just to make sure I'm clear on what we're looking for, you want me to describe a little bit more about what I experienced at the camp and kind of take us through the slides. Does that sound right?
Yep, it's your show.
Great. Well, this first...
if you want to advance... Sorry, Nate. If you want to advance the slides, you can put your cursor at the right arrow.
Okay.
And you can advance the slides.
Perfect. Thank you, Chad. So this first picture is actually from the weekend that I was there. I got there on the Saturday just before the security officers released some dogs on the protectors there, and I got there just shortly after that happened. So a lot of people were talking about that as we got there, and this picture here was from the day after. There was just a huge gathering of folks. It was estimated to be about 500 people that marched on the road to the site where some of the bulldozers had dug up the burial grounds of some of their ancestors. And so this, what you're seeing there, the Defend the Sacred, was that just massive people. And we all traveled to the site where they dug up the graves. We formed a circle there. And I think it's important to know about this particular ceremony because I think it sort of exemplifies the feeling of the whole camp there. It's a very incredible spiritual grounding. There are prayers that are happening all the time. But what happened was we formed a circle, and there were medicine men that came forward. There were spiritual women and men leaders that came out. There were dancers, some dancers, and singers. And we did this 1 hour ceremony, maybe it was even a little longer, and of prayers for the ancestors that had been dug up. So I think that that really exemplified my experience there of what was happening, people talking about nonviolence, kind of left and right. This must be a nonviolent movement. And it was a really, nothing like I'd ever seen it or been a part of. It was really an incredible experience. Click on my next slide here. So just a little personal context, because I think this is also probably a similar story from people all over the country. There was 14 of us from the Duluth or Cloquet area here, many folks from the Fond du Lac Reservation, a few folks that actually were originally from tribes out close to Standing Rock. And the trailer you see there is full of donations that we brought out, and that's also typical of a lot of groups that have come in groups of 10 to 15, bringing lots of supplies. And when we were there, it was still on the growing movement. There was probably 2,000 to 3,000 people. Now I've heard up to 6,000 people there. Go to my next slide here. So you'll see, I'm going to do a little comparison here. What you see is the entrance of the camp. These are some of the folks that I came with. The flags you see up there are each representing the tribes that are there. And at that time when I was there, I think there were between 150, I heard like 150 to 200. And the latest number I heard was close to 300 now. So it really has increased in the number of groups from around the country. The next slide I'll go to here is from last weekend. Another friend of mine from Duluth went out, and you can see the flags really have almost doubled there. It's a really beautiful photo of that day and representing all those different flags. The next one here. So this is a picture of the camp from one of the nearby hills. You can't really see it from this photo, but the landscape there, a lot of rolling hills, but there's also a lot of buttes. It's sort of the space just before the Badlands starts. So I wanted to give you a little picture of the landscape, especially as a part of folks connected to watershed discipleship, to really understand the land is an important piece here. So we're looking at the Red Warrior Camp. There's also the Sacred Stone Camp, which is just down, I don't remember if it's down or up the river. If you're looking this way to the left, you see very in the distance before the tree line there's a river that separates the Red Warrior Camp, the front line camp, from the Sacred Stone Camp. So the next picture, I think, gives you another flavor of what folks are experiencing there. And this was also from last weekend, so the camp has grown since that time. Next slide here. So this was during a time when there wasn't actually a lot of people gathered. This space is the main gathering space, where oftentimes there are speakers, almost a constant stream of speakers. I heard a woman who is the granddaughter of Louis Farrakhan. She is African American and Lakota, and she was the first person to walk out and stop the bulldozers when they started digging up the graves. She asked an elder if she could go out. The elder said yes. So she and another African American man who she was with was making the connection, saying, as African Americans, indigenous folks harbored us when we were escaping from slavery, and now we are here showing up and putting our bodies on the line for you. So there's a really there's a historic clarity that I experienced there, and it really made me wonder where are people in my white community? What kind of historical clarity might we have in, it might not be out in front in speaking, but it made me wonder, where are my elders? Where are the people from my community? And certainly there are other white folks there, but it started my imagination wondering, how do we bring more people? What's the right place? Where is our moment in this historic moment? Another picture of the landscape. Lots of teepees there. Folks are talking about, really being in this for the long haul, and they're already starting to bring out supplies for the winter. And I think already lots of teepees have arrived since my time there, just even a week or a week and a half ago now. So a little more pictures of the camp. This was also another, just to give you sort of a picture of what people were experiencing there. Oops, I'm shifting around a little bit. There we go. Lots of small camps, lots of tribal affiliations. People that were coming in and out really felt like family. People would come in and say, "Hey, can I have some coffee?" And I'm Nathan. What's your name? And it was just felt like a huge family gathering. Some more folks. The person in the middle there was stationed there, or was deciding to stay there long term, and he was kind of heading up. He and his wife Donna there to our left, looking on the picture there. She heads up the tent and cooks all the food. Sheila on the right side went back this last weekend, and she said that they were overwhelmed with the amount of people that they're trying to feed. So that was another big need, that in asking people to come to help serve food, cook food. What was maybe 30 or 40 people when we were there, this last weekend was 300. So it's really increased a lot, and there's a big need for food and supplies in that way. This is a picture of me and a few other folks that went along. In the background there is, I believe that's it either connects to the Missouri River or is the Missouri River there. There were a number of streams that connected to the river, but that gives you a picture of the landscape from high above as well. And this last one, of course, there were lots of signs that people had up everywhere of Indigenous solidarity signs, and no DAPL, so no Dakota Access Pipeline. And one thing I'm remembering from my experience as well from that space where we marched is kind of the front line where they were trying to hold back the pipeline. They had put up tobacco pouches and put them all over the fence, and that was partially as a way to say, this is our sacred tobacco. It's a religious space, and it was that was one more way for them to say, legally you can't encroach on our sacred spaces. So I guess that's what I have to share about the camp itself and the experience there. To really, a lot of folks, when I got back, I was really trying to get the word out as much as possible to what I experienced there, because a lot of the mainstream media, at least at that point, really hadn't even picked this up at all, and a lot of outlets, local outlets, had been saying that the protesters were attacking the officers, and really no mention of the incredible unity and spiritual nature of this camp.
Nathan, thank you. I'm wondering if and folks.
Nathan, thank you. I'm wondering if and folks, there's the.
Nate, I'm going to need you to mute your microphone here for a second while I speak. Thank you. There's the URL if you want more information on the ongoing resistance. This is a movement that is really growing exponentially as word gets out, particularly with the significant, if partial, victory last Friday. But Nathan, I'm wondering if you can just summarize for folks who might be new to this issue what the essential struggle is about, what the Dakota Access Pipeline is proposing, and you'll need to turn your microphone back on for that.
Great, thanks, Jed. Yeah, I'll do my best to summarize what I know on this. I've learned a lot recently. I mean, this was really for me. I knew about it and had been asked to go along, so I sort of got launched into this and have learned many pieces along the way. So really, this is the Dakota Access Pipeline is to bring Bakken oil down to the Gulf of Mexico, and so the pipeline actually originally was supposed to go through just north of Bismarck. And my understanding is that a lot of members of the white community there were saying, we don't want this to go through just north of us because we'll be downstream of it. And so they proposed that it go just north of the reservation, and was pretty immediately approved. So to me, a lot of folks talking about this is environmental racism. This is as you link it back to the biblical story, this is Lazarus that we're talking about here, the picture, and so there are many layers to this as well. It's there's the environmental piece that indigenous folks are saying that we need to keep the oil in the ground. We need to protect our water. So there's the larger picture that many of the folks that are there are talking about. But there's also the more immediate protecting our water from pipeline spill. So I would say that's the majority of the framing in the camp is knowing that from other experiences, pipelines do break, and that is inevitable at some point in time. And so it's really trying to say we're protecting the water from inevitable spills in the future. Now, there are other pieces to this as well that talking about tribal sovereignty and tribal input into the process. And as I mentioned, it was approved pretty quickly just north of the reservation without much consultation of the tribe. But then there's also this piece that comes into play that there are burial grounds in the way of the pipeline. So I think that has also really electrified this this story that a lot of folks that maybe aren't on board with. I just had a conversation in my church tonight, actually. Some folks that are not necessarily on board of saying no to pipelines are on board with saying we need to respect burial grounds. So that is also part of the framing and the complexity of this issue, and that folks, that's also what's energizing people to go to the front lines and saying we are going to stand in front of the bulldozers because we don't want our burial grounds dug up, and we also want to protect our water. Does that speak to what you're asking there, Chip?
Thank you, Nathan. If you want to mute your microphone. Thank you. Great report. We so appreciate your, first, the fact that you went down there with the support of your partner, Sarah, to journey with folks there, and secondly, that you have made yourself available to share that with us, and these great pictures really help bring that alive for us. So thank you so much for your work and witness on that. Sarah and Nathan are deeply involved in these issues in Duluth, Minnesota, as are many of you on this webinar. What I want to do in the last 15 minutes or so is now invite those of you who have now heard two very compelling stories, a biblical one and a contemporary story of a very strong Lazarus resting in the bosom of Mother Earth and resisting the wiles of the petroleum industry, to to have a little bit of back and forth is for this we use our chat function, and I want to invite you to avail yourself of that if you have a question or a comment. While you all are doing that, I do want to again draw your attention to the fact that one of our participants tonight is Kelly Johnson. I believe this is her first webinar. Kelly teaches, as she says there in the chat box, in Dayton, Ohio, and is a friend and a colleague who's written a number of things, not least of which is a brilliant book called The Fear of Beggars, Stewardship and Poverty in Christian Ethics, that was published in 2007. Chris, if you're there, and if Kelly is willing, while folks chat in questions or comments, I would love it if we could see if we can get Kelly at least to have a voice, if not a video. Kelly, if you are willing, I didn't know you were going to be on. We don't usually do this live. And Nate, I'm going to say thank you very much. So appreciate your, actually, Nathan, I think we better keep you on here because there may be questions about your presentation. But in the meantime, let's see if we can get Kelly, which means, Kelly, you've got to work with Chris to get some video and audio if you have that available, and just type in if you don't. In the meantime, I do want to remind you all that our next quarterly webinar will be on Tuesday, December 13th, and we will look at Our Lady of Guadalupe in Scripture and Culture. This, of course, is a great syncretic image of indigeneity and the Christian tradition, and we're going to see the ways in which this incredible tradition from immediately post-conquest Mexico in the 16th century has become a symbol for cultural struggle and resistance and its deep roots in Scripture. So that's going to be our next webinar. We really need your help to rebuild our platform and get an audience, so we hope you will help us do that. You can always go to chedmyers.org and find the information you need. And look at this, by the miracle of modern technology. Kelly, we see you. Let's see if we can hear you. We can't hear you yet, but we'll keep working on that. We can see you great. I do want to hear Kelly's ad hoc reflections on the story of Lazarus and Dives, because she is someone who's really done a lot of very good reflection on these issues. So we'll keep trying to see if we can get her. You've got to turn your microphone on, Kelly, if we can see you. In the meantime, other participants, please type questions and comments, and we'll see them over the chat function that you have on your lower left. Sounds like we've got... Say something, Kelly. No, we still don't hear you. I do want to take a pause and allow folks to type in questions. Those can be questions either to myself or to Nate, and we'll keep working on trying to get Kelly's voice in here. Say a few words, Kelly. Let's see if we can hear you yet.
Yeah.
You're there we go. You're very faint. See if you can increase the volume on your microphone. That's a little better. If you can get a little bit more volume, that will be even better. You're still pretty faint. We can't really hear you yet. usually try to work this out beforehand, so we don't usually do this in real time, but it's too good of a temptation. All right. Kelly, try leaning into your mic a little bit. See if that helps.
You know, I actually don't even know where my mic is.
We can hear you now. That made a difference. Okay. Wonderful. So just lean toward your computer. Your mic is somewhere on your computer. That's great. Kelly, we can see you. We can hear you. It's so nice to welcome you to the webinar on this very impromptu basis. Maybe you can just say a word about some of the work you've done around poverty and mendicancy, and maybe any reflections you have on the Dives and Lazarus story.
Well, I was planning on just listening in tonight. I think Chad's read of these things is so illuminating. I think the point you made earlier, that we tend to look at the ancient world and think, well, things must have been more unjust then. We've made so much progress, and for us to recognize that, in fact, the situation we're in is, if anything, worse, is a really significant thing to notice. I guess, you know, my work on the tradition of voluntary begging had to do with the fact that within our tradition, in fact, it is the voice of those who live in poverty which has been more authoritative. And the turn toward stewardship thinking has left us with the impression, conveniently, for those of us who have more money, that people who have more money are the ones who get to make the decisions and who have more authority. I guess one thing and this is totally speculative in the text, but I think one thing that's different about our relationship to
Kelly, lean a little bit more into your computer here. Lean toward your computer so we can hear you better. Thank you.
You know, one of the differences is the story doesn't tell us that that Dives bore any responsibility for Lazarus having been reduced to poverty. And yet the situation of the Native Americans is, in fact, they have been reduced to the situation they're in by a history of structural injustice, by violence. So it seems to me that that's a little difference, right? That, if anything, means we ought to take the struggle at Standing Rock even more seriously.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Now, I would argue that the juxtaposing of Lazarus and Dives, particularly in the context not only of Luke 16, but of the series of stories that Jesus tells about the rich and the ways in which those stories are juxtaposed with the life of the poor, does suggest that there is a structural relationship that Luke understood, and that Luke was trying to address that by getting the wealthy and the privileged to actually work against the structures of their own privilege by redistributing wealth. This is something, of course, that poor people are, in Luke's gospel, poor people such as Lazarus might be considered somewhat passive, although the blind beggar in the second diptych in Luke 18, at the end of Luke 18, is the blind beggar is someone who actually gets up and follows Jesus. So there is very much the notion that both poor and rich are invited to discipleship. You are very correct to point out that in the case of Standing Rock, we have very much a disenfranchised community that is acting very much animating its own resistance. And that is something that we need to pay attention to, as Nathan has pointed out to us. Any other thoughts, Kelly, that you have? And feel free to free associate. I apologize for putting you to work on your sabbatical, but it's just such a privilege to have you on our webinar. You are really one of the great theologians in our country, and so appreciate your work. Any other words you might want to speak, or perhaps you would tell us what you're working on, if anything, on your sabbatical?
I tuned in actually because I'm trying to figure out, and Chad, this will sound familiar to you from conversations long ago. I'm still trying to figure out how theologians can more effectively be building up the church. And so I'm interested to watch what happens when you're engaging people in this kind of work. I don't have anything brilliant to say actually about the scripture, in spite of my being such a brilliant person at the moment.
Well, I really want to commend to our listenership this book of Kelly's. It's a really fine piece of writing as well as analysis, and it's a real privilege to have Kelly join us on this webinar. Mike Boucher, who is tuning in from Rochester, New York, has made the comment that many liberal Christians say they notice the poor outside their gates, and yet inequality continues to grow. This is really a conundrum, I think, for our churches, is that inequality in fact does continue to grow. It is structural, and this is a text, the story of Dives and Lazarus. It's a text that I would argue haunts the Christian church. I mentioned at the top of the webinar that it's ubiquitous in the history of Christian art. In all eras of the 2 millennia of Christendom, you find this story bubbling up in Christian art, in literature, and of course it gets read once every 3 years in the common lectionary. It is a tough text. I do believe it is a warning tale. It is a counsel for us to go back to the scriptural tradition, back to what we call the biblical vision of Sabbath Economics, and to figure out step by step, how do we integrate Sabbath Economics into our own lives as households, as communities of faith, as neighborhoods, and this really is the challenge that this text puts to us. Nate, I'm wondering if you have any further reflections, or perhaps Sarah, who I know is standing just behind you, on connections that you felt as you were listening to the webinar and just back from Standing Rock. And don't forget to activate your microphone. I'm big on putting people on the spot tonight.
Yeah, I definitely have some thoughts on that, but I actually want to first check in with Sarah here, because she was, I just want to say a word of thanks to her, because she was really posting left and right, reading all the articles while I was gone. There was really no cell reception where I was. So, Sarah, do you have anything that you want to share? Okay, I'll go first, and then we'll see if she has more to add. Yeah, here we go. Let's get Sarah in the picture here. That I wanted to say that we just talked about tonight was looking at liberal Christianity. What happens sometimes, especially around environmental justice issues, is there's this piece of, well, don't we use oil too? All the people who came to Standing Rock had gasoline, and I think there's much to say to that. It seems to me one of the biggest things that come up for people that I'm connected to in these liberal circles is, well, aren't we being hypocritical? And I think there's a number of things you can say to that, but the piece that I want to focus in on is, I think sometimes complexities stop liberal Christians from any kind of action. Say, well, I don't have it figured out, or conflicted about it, so I'm just going to sit back. Someone tonight pointed out that's being paralyzed is a privilege. That is a privileged position. And I think it is up to us to wrestle with, not everyone agrees on all points. There are a number of are important to consider. And even listening to some indigenous voices back here saying the same thing, saying people think I should go out to Standing Rock, but I'm conflicted about it. So I think it is important to realize that there are, just like in the dominant white larger society, there are many perspectives. But I think what we need to not do, especially in our, if we have privilege, is to still take action, live in the congregation. So I think I'll leave it there and see Sarah has her word.
Just mute your mic real quick while Sarah gathers her thoughts. In the blog that will go up on Thursday on radicaldiscipleship.net, I really address exactly that issue that you've raised, Nathan, which is the fact that we are all caught and complicit in this system, in what Dorothy Day calls the filthy, rotten system. And yet, at the same time, we are compelled by the gospel to struggle to build the shell of a new world in the shell of the old world of that system. Another Dorothy Day quote. The first half of Luke 16, the story of the defective manager, as I call it, is exactly a story of someone who is both a beneficiary and a victim of the system of privilege, who has to figure out how to take creative action. And I think that's exactly what you all have done by standing in solidarity with Standing Rock. So I think that's Luke 16 is just a brilliant fulcrum of ethics and theology on which Luke's entire gospel rests. And this is a good season in the church when we get to hear these stories. Sarah, any thoughts from you? No,
yeah,
you're shaking your head.
There's so many thoughts, but it's really hard to put it in a few sentences. I really feel like it was I hadn't heard anything about it yet, and really got to see how Nathan being there as our community, our white Christian community here, really awoke, made people wake up in a way that maybe they would not have. So when I think about what people's roles are with privilege, people are saying that they can't. A piece of it is that when Nathan, who works at our church, can go, all of a sudden, people, after I gave the announcement about the dogs, the church came up to me with tears in their eyes, telling me how much they love Nathan. And then it as soon as you know and love Lazarus, you can't say no to the cause anymore. So just thinking about how we weave in our hearts with those who are standing there, the beautiful, the video you showed with the woman singing. I just feel like in this age of social media, none of us have an excuse not to hear and know the stories and get attached to them. And there's a million ways to be involved with this too, that it just doesn't stop. So there's no excuse to be paralyzed, I don't think.
Well, I want to again thank you to both Nathan and Sarah, who Nathan was scheduled, and a special thanks to Kelly Johnson, who wasn't scheduled, and thank you for being willing to say a few words. It's always a nicer community event when we get a few voices in here. I do want to direct our attention in closing to what our friend Jane Hope writes. Jane runs a house of hospitality for Koori people, Aboriginal folk in Melbourne, Australia, who come to the city to visit family members in the hospital. It's a kind of a Catholic worker style house. And she is pointing out that despite all the charitable investments of both government and churches, there is so little in the economic and social changes of the First Peoples of Australia. And so she emphasizes that the stories that they hear in that house and that they bear then to the churches is a way of de-abstracting these issues and making it more intimate than remote, which is something I believe that the story that Luke tells of Lazarus and the rich man is trying to do. It's trying to humanize a structural condition. And that is, at least in part, I believe, the role of our churches to take these issues, to unmask them in their reality, to personalize them and humanize them in order to mobilize us and our imaginations to do work to deconstruct the gulf. But we are left by Luke's story with the charge that if we do not deconstruct this gulf in life, then in some mysterious way we will have to reckon with that gulf in the cosmos, and that gives a huge push, I believe, to us to put our resources toward the deconstruction of that gulf. The kind of work that Kelly Johnson's doing theologically, that Nate and Sarah are doing pastorally in their community in Duluth, and the kind of work that Jane Hope is doing in her House of Hospitality in Melbourne. Thanks to all of you. We are at our time here. Thanks to all of you who have tuned in and stayed here till the end. We always appreciate you joining us for these webinars. We hope you'll return and let your friends know of these webinars as a resource, whether that's Jeff Broughton's class in Canberra or households in Whidbey Island or Rochester, New York. We're so grateful that you all have joined us. Please do tune in for our next webinar 3 months from now, where we'll look at the great legacy of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Thanks again, Nate, for joining us. Thanks, Kelly, for at the drop of a hat interrupting your sabbatical to join us. And thanks all of you for being part of this webinar. We'll see you next quarter. Bye for now.